Hello, this is your host, and today we are going to answer the question, what is utilitarianism? Now, if that sounds like an easy question for you, well, it may be, but then again, maybe it's not. You see, in philosophy, there's always more to things than meets the eye. In other words, utilitarianism is all about maximizing overall happiness or well-being. So for example, if you were trying to decide what to do on Saturday night and you could either spend it with your friends playing video games or with your significant other at a nice restaurant. There are a bunch of different ones. And so when talking about utilitarianism, philosophers sometimes use the term act utilitarianism to refer to this specific form of consequentialism. Act utilitarianism is the view that you should always perform the action that will maximize happiness, regardless of what the rules say. So for example, if your friend asks you to keep a secret and then later asks you to tell them who they invited to their birthday party, there are lots of different ways to understand what it means to maximize happiness, what counts as a good or bad consequence, and what exactly we mean by actions producing consequences. And these are all hotly debated topics among philosophers. So it's not surprising that even a seemingly simple question like what is utilitarianism can lead to long and complicated answers. We are implicitly making a number of assumptions about what it means to maximize happiness and well-being, but this assumption is also problematic. How exactly do we measure happiness and suffering? And how do we compare them to each other? These are difficult questions that utilitarianism doesn't really answer. And so a sophisticated answer to the question what is utilitarianism needs to address these issues. It can't just be a simple definition. It has to include discussions of all the underlying assumptions that are being made as well. We are assuming, for example, that happiness is a good thing and that suffering is a bad thing. But those aren't actually universally accepted assumptions. Some people think that suffering can be a good thing, for example, if it leads to personal growth, while others think that happiness is overrated and that we should value other things like knowledge and wisdom above it. Also, subscribe to our channel so that we can keep making videos like this in the future. So, for example, if you were a Buddhist, you might reject utilitarianism because you think that it puts too much emphasis on happiness. Act utilitarianism would say that you should tell them because keeping secrets is only right if it maximizes happiness. When Jeremy Bentham first proposed utilitarianism as an ethical theory in the late 18th century, he did so in part as a critique of existing ethical theories, many of which were based on religion. If you ask a philosopher what utilitarianism is, you'll probably get a pretty good answer. But if you ask someone who took one philosophy class many years ago, they might not remember much about it at all. So you might get an answer like, well, it's that thing where you do whatever makes the most people the happiest. Or you might get an answer like, I don't know, it's that thing with the greatest good for the greatest number of people, I think, which itself leads to another. What exactly does greatest good mean? See, this happens when people aren't used to thinking deeply and systematically about philosophical issues. But when they are, they tend to take issue with even the most basic definitions and explanations. And so it goes with utilitarianism. So, for example, he argued against the idea that we should act according to divine commands or natural law by saying that what matters is what produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Over time, though, people began to accept the idea that we should maximize happiness as an ethical theory in its own right, apart from any connection to critiques of other theories. Unfortunately, though, many of those people still had a tendency to misunderstand what utilitarianism was. They thought that it meant that we should only ever consider the happiness of others and never our own, or that we should only ever consider the happiness of the majority and never worrying about the rights of minorities. Both of these misunderstandings led to criticisms of utilitarianism, which in turn led philosophers to feel the need to defend it against those criticisms. But in this case, telling the truth will maximize happiness. Utilitarianism would suggest that you do whatever will maximize happiness. So for example, if your friend asks you to keep a secret and then later asks you to tell them who they invited to their birthday party, well, it's actually pretty hard to come up with a completely satisfactory answer to this question. But here are three possible answers. Rule consequentialism would say that you should keep the secret because breaking the rule of secrecy would produce bad consequences. This could either be because it would make your friend unhappy or because it would undermine the social norms of promising and therefore make society worse. Rule consequentialism can also be combined with other ethical theories. For example, someone who combines rule consequentialism with Kantianism might say that we should generally follow the rules, unless doing so would produce really bad consequences. Whereas someone who combines rule consequentialism with virtue ethics might say that we should generally follow the rules, unless doing so would prevent us from acting virtuously. And so if you think that playing video games with your friends will make everyone involved happier, then that's what you should do. But if you think that spending time with your significant other will make them happier and perhaps even make you happier as well, then that's what you should do instead. And so after answering this question in as clear a way as we can, we will also try to show you why answering simple questions about complex philosophical concepts like this can be more complicated than it looks. So let's get started. So, utilitarianism is an ethical theory that says that the right action is the one that results in the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist ethical theory, which means that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on the consequences of that action. This contrasts with deontological ethical theories, which say that there are some things that are right or wrong in and of themselves, regardless of their consequences. For example, Kantianism is a deontological ethical theory that says that we should always act according to the categorical imperative, which is a set of rules that tell us what we ought to do in various situations. So, for example, if someone asks you to do something that violates your own rational interests, the categorical imperative tells us that we should not do it just because someone asked us to do it. Instead, we should only do it if we have good reasons for doing it. Well, utilitarianism isn't the only consequentialist ethical theory out there. Another form of consequentialism is rule consequentialism, which is the view that you should follow the rules, unless doing so would produce bad consequences. Okay, so now that we have a pretty solid definition of utilitarianism down, we can move on to our second question: why is it hard to answer simple questions about utilitarianism? First, we can point to the fact that utilitarianism is actually quite a controversial ethical theory. Second, we can point to the fact that many people misunderstand what utilitarianism is. And third, we can point to the fact that many people simply haven't had enough exposure to philosophy. When we define utilitarianism as an ethical theory that says that the right action is the one that results in the greatest good for the greatest number of people, we are also assuming that we can actually measure happiness and suffering in some way and that we can compare them to each other to figure out which ones are greater and which ones are lesser. And so that is why it is that answering seemingly simple questions about complex philosophical concepts like utilitarianism can be more complicated than it looks. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it with your friends.